Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the 6.3.0 mid-chapter PTB and the changes that are, and conspicuously aren't in it, and what that means for both my favourite killer, the Twins, and the wider landscape of Dead by Daylight. A few weeks ago I spoke hopefully of the upcoming mid-chapter, bringing the long-awaited update to the Twins that was mentioned back in January, and the notion of a Twins update coming in the near future really seemed to have caught on. A lot of other content creators, including my good friend and fellow Twins main Linksy and even Otstava, joined me spitballing that a Twins update was probably around the corner. This concern about the future of the Twins was amplified when the announcement of the finisher Moris system came out, which showcased two major changes Behaviour wanted to make to DBD that were being previewed for early testing in the new mid-chapter's PTB. The changes are as follows. When all the survivors remaining in the trial are hooked or on the ground, the killer will automatically Mori the last one and immediately end the game, killing any survivors remaining in the trial. The other change is the base kit self-recovery update for Survivor. Now the time to fill up your recovery bar by yourself will be 45 seconds, but once you do so, you can completely recover from the dying state on your own, and you can do this a number of times. This would be coupled with a buff to Unbreakable that just set the perk's increased recovery time at 100%, meaning a survivor can fully recover from the dying state in 22.5 seconds any number of times. These announcements proved to be controversial, but don't fret, yet. Behaviour said this mid-chapter would not feature these changes and the PTB was an early chance to test them out, and provide some feedback. With this knowledge, I was almost certain a Twins update was coming this mid-chapter, in part because base kit anti-slugging affects Twins more than any other killer in the game, and in part because, well, something's got to be in this new mid-chapter update, right? Like, if the finisher Mori system isn't coming, what is? The only thing we know Behaviour had on the docket was the Twins update, so it seemed obvious that was what was coming. The PTB patch notes just came out and dashed the hopes we had about that against the rocks like a ship in a storm. Because aside from the finisher Mori stuff, which still isn't coming in the mid-chapter by the way, we basically have nothing. Setting aside the finisher Mori, the changes we've got are optimization improvements for the Huntress and minor changes to the archive challenge system. That's genuinely it. And I'm kind of amazed because I didn't think Behaviour would effectively skip a mid-chapter completely. Admittedly, we're still on track to get the Michaela and Ghostface Tome stories and this year's Halloween event, but in terms of balance changes or reworks, we're getting absolutely nothing. This has me quite seriously worried for several reasons. The first one being that Behaviour seems to have pretty much thrown live individual killer balancing into the wind. Let's put this into perspective here. The last killer to be buffed or nerfed immediately after their release was Pinhead well over a year ago. Artist, Sadako, Dredge and now Wesker have all been skipped over for balance updates since their release. And that's really worrying when one of those is a top 3 or 4 killer, and another is probably the worst killer in the game. If Behaviour doesn't update their newly released killers to make sure they stick the landing properly, that's a very bad sign. What's worse, however, is the implication that Twins are not a high priority fix for Behaviour, when they absolutely should be, especially in light of the substantial nerfs to slugging coming in this finisher Mori update that affects them disproportionately. Twins have been the chew toy of Behaviour's balance team for almost 2 years now. They released Buggy, remain the least popular killer in the game, and have only ever received overall nerfs, along with minimal meaningful bug fixes to ensure they stay that way. And to understand why Twins are getting a rework at this time is such a big deal, we have to look at the nature of the anti-slugging features. I do just want to get out of the way here and say that I understand why people don't like being slugged, especially if the killer is doing it to BM. And to many this update is effectively a panacea, a medicine to treat a sickness that the game has, and we have to live with the side effects to make the game healthier overall. But seriously, it's been almost 2 years. There is absolutely no excuse for the Twins not to have been changed in this time if these upcoming anti-slugging changes were so important. You might think I'm overreacting, I'm hyperbolic, and if that's something that you believe, you're welcome to do so. I just want to be able to play our favourite killer in 3 months' time, and given Behaviour's track record of just leaving Twins in a fucking ditch, I have no confidence in the developers' inclination or ability to make these changes work for Twins, or to make Twins work for these changes. Every time a new patch comes out, it feels like a new attack on my favourite killer, and I'm not giving up this one without a fight. The self-pickup features have 2 pretty substantial issues. both of which affect Twins more than any other killer, but ultimately affect everyone to some degree. The first being that the time taken to completely recover from the dying state may be just too short, especially with the new buffed Unbreakable in the equation, and the second being the inherent gameplay issues of survivors being able to recover themselves infinitely, regardless how long the recovery time takes. But before I get going, I want to say something momentarily about the finisher Moris mechanic itself, because I don't understand why it exists. Yeah, sure, if everybody in the trial is basically out of action, the game immediately ends with a Moris, but which killers does this actively benefit the most? It isn't the low lethality M1 killers because their chases aren't quick enough to incapacitate multiple survivors one after the other, and it isn't the limited time snowball killers like Oni or Plague, because survivors can happily just hide or shift W your power until it runs out and watch survivors start picking themselves up. The only killers it benefits are hyper-mobile, incredibly lethal chase killers. So basically just Nurse and Blight. There's a reason that the PTB right now is basically just full of world record nurses and Blight with incredibly stupid add-ons. Because these are the killers that benefit the most from survivors having their recovery methods completely locked out. After a pretty great series of balance changes targeted at making M1 killers more viable, this just seems like a massive step back and a push towards players still playing the one or two incredibly powerful top tiers at the expense of every other killer who has to deal with survivors just picking themselves up whenever they want. If it was up to me, this entire mechanic would be scrapped and we'd start again, but I think we've come too far for that. So let's just treat both the finisher Moris and the infinite recoveries as something that we have to just deal with. Facts of life in Dead by Daylight now that we just kinda have to accept to some degree. Let's start off here by establishing something important. Slugging is a part of Dead by Daylight that a lot of stuff is balanced around. Flashlight saves, pallet saves, sabotages, hook dead zones, hook denial perks like Boil Over. All these things are balanced around the killer's ability to, at any time, just not hook the survivor. Leave them on the ground or drop them off the shoulder if the opportunity to do so doesn't present itself. It's why there's an inherent risk to going for a pallet save, because if the killer realises what you're doing, they can just leave the slug on the ground and chase the rescuer, meaning a third person has to get off the generator to get the pickup, potentially allowing the killer to snowball as survivors have to get off gens to recover their teammates. This is one of the reasons why Unbreakable is so good, especially if the whole team knows you have it and plays around it, because it alleviates the killer's pressure without someone else needing to get off their generator to save you. They can just keep slamming gens. Unbreakable on live servers removes the risk of hook denial through pallet saves, sabotages or flashlight saves, because no matter what the killer does, they're losing pressure. Either they pick up and the survivor gets saved, or they slug and the survivor gets saved. Are we beginning to see the problem yet? If a survivor goes down at a pallet, and another survivor contests the pallet save on this new update, the killer has a pretty unpleasant choice to make. They can either pick up the slug and just let the survivor get the save, or chase the rescuer and let the person under the pallet recover. Unless the killer gets the down on the rescuer very, very quickly, that pressure they accrue from having two people out of commission at once just doesn't exist. Because the other two can just sit on gens during this recovery time. And that's assuming you can even convert the second down into a hook. What happens if, say, the rescuer goes down under a pallet and a third survivor can test the save? By this time, the first slug will likely have picked themselves up, and the fourth survivor has had almost a full minute of uninterrupted gen time. And what's the killer done wrong here? The only other option is to pick up the survivor immediately and just let them get pallet saved. The same logic applies to other means of hook denial, such as sabotage and flashlight saves, assuming the survivor goes down somewhere that removes the possibility of just looking at a wall. Twins suffer by far the most from this because of the inherently long time between downing a survivor and picking them up. Say Victor downed a survivor at a pallet and another survivor runs up and kicks him, something that happens all the time playing this killer. That survivor will immediately start picking up, and when Charlotte arrives they'll contest the pallet save. Notably, the recovery time of a survivor healing you off the ground remains 16 seconds, so even if it just takes 8 seconds for Charlotte to foot slog over to the down, that's half their recovery bar. So that window of 45 seconds that you have before they pick themselves up is looking more like 20 or 25 seconds. You are not getting that pickup, it's just not going to happen. Because Twins give players so much time to set up saves and search for recovery time before Charlotte can threaten a pickup, Twins are very vulnerable to hook denial plays and perks, which is one of the reasons that it slugs so much. But if you can't slug, and survivors can prevent you from getting hooks, what the fuck are you supposed to do? your only option is to potentially catch someone without Victor being kicked, find someone injured and then down them too to start a snowball rolling. But what's the logical outcome of that? Victor can only threaten a down on injured people and has a 5-second stun every time he gets one. Even assuming every survivor is injured and you play perfectly, you never miss a pounce, and they never kick you, all it takes is one survivor hopping in a locker and the first and second people that you downed are going to pick themselves up before Charlotte can get there. Twins effectively cannot exert pressure anymore because of the mechanics of the game physically preventing them from hooking or slugging survivors. The issue is present to a lesser degree with other killers too, typically ones with limited resources that they have to use in a short period of time, like Oni, Plague, Myers, or even ammunition killers like Huntress or Trickster. These killers are all balanced around using their powers as effectively as possible in a short time span before they have to reload or they run out of power. But how will these killers be affected when the game's inherent mechanics punish you for using them effectively to down multiple survivors at once? The issue of survivors being able to set up risk-free saves affects killers with limited windows of effectiveness, and obviously Twins, more so than any other killer, but it does affect everyone. And it's one of the big reasons I was hoping Twins and potentially other badly affected killers got an update before or at the same time as this mechanic arrived. Because Twins were not designed to be able to handle survivors magically regenerating health states, and being able to set up saves without any risk of the killer snowballing off of that. Don't get me wrong, Unbreakable does create situations on the live servers, but the difference is, Unbreakable is one use only. Once a survivor has used it up, you can slug them without fear. But when this can be done repeatedly, creating these no-win scenarios at every contested pallet save, if survivors start contesting downs and going down in the right places, games are going to effectively grind to a halt. But you know what? Let's assume I'm wrong here. Let's assume a killer can get a down and hook in 45 seconds in most circumstances, so they can maintain their pressure after chasing a rescuer. Maybe they're playing a very lethal killer, maybe they're on a map full of dead zones, maybe the survivor just fucked up and stepped in a bear trap. Would that still be true if the number was 22 seconds? Because that's where Unbreakable comes in, one of the best perks in the game, that received somehow a substantial buff. If multiple players in one team have Unbreakable, the finisher Moris mechanic may as well not exist. Because there's no way on planet Earth even remotely competent teammates are going to go down that quickly to any killer except specifically a starstruck nurse. And remember, unlike current Unbreakable, you can't burn through them and maybe catch them out again later. UB with the 100% recovery speed boost just means you cannot slug by any means, at any time, for any reason. Every issue I went over for the 45-second recovery time gets amplified when Unbreakable enters the equation. If you can't hook a survivor through no fault of your own, that down you got just doesn't matter. And how many killers can really afford to lose potentially multiple downs a match and still have any reasonable chance of winning? Of course you can just turbo tunnel someone out the game to force a team to get off gens by making it a 3v1, but an anti-slugging update encouraging killers to tunnel because they can't slip pressure anymore seems wrong. The natural answer to these situations would be just to increase the amount of time it takes to recover from the dying state by yourself, to make it more reasonable that a killer can down a potential rescue before you can fully recover. This would probably also require Unbreakable to be thrown into the sea, because if not, all you're doing is making Unbreakable a requirement for coordinated teams to just keep doing this, and force them to use up a perk slot, of which they have 4 each, to just do exactly the same thing they were doing before. But increasing the timer to, say, 60 seconds has consequences. Most notably, what happens if a Blight or a Nurse decides to try and use the finisher Moris mechanic to slug everybody, and you don't have a means to recover easily? It's a very strange situation, because if you ask me, a 45-second base kit self-recovery is both too slow for Nurses or Blights with insane add-ons and builds, to stop them just ending the game incredibly early due to the finisher Moris mechanic, and simultaneously too fast to make it fair on regular killers engaging in regular gameplay. It's impossible to balance properly. Even just taking the recovery to 60 seconds would make it a lot fairer against most killers, but would also make Blight and Nurse even more obnoxious, so, how do you plan on balancing this? But what if I told you that wouldn't actually solve the biggest problem with infinite self-pickups? The lose-lose scenarios of unhookable builds. There are a decent number of survivor perks that specialise in denying the killer the ability to get the hook. Breakdown takes a hook out of commission for 3 minutes. Power Struggle and Boil Over punish the killer for pathing to a hook in a certain way. There's even a mechanic in the base game where a survivor dying on a hook removes that hook from the game, potentially creating whole chunks of a map where a survivor can't be carried to a hook because the only hook in the area has been used up. The counter to these scenarios, should a survivor just flat out refuse to leave the area, was always to bleed them out. Either they move into a place where you can hook them, or you just don't hook them. And given that staying on the ground for 4 minutes isn't very fun, most survivors just took the L and let you hook them. But now, if the environment and perks do not allow you to hook a survivor, that option no longer exists. The survivor can pick themselves up as much as they want, meaning they can effectively hold the game hostage if you don't keep coming back to keep downing them over and over again. The finisher Mori helps with this in theory. If everyone goes to this location and you down them all, the game just ends, but all it takes is one person to be on the other side of the map doing gens, and the problem is still there, because you're not going down that person before someone gets picked up. There's one perk more than any other that showcases the problem perfectly, and it's not unbreakable actually. It's a perk I've had a vendetta against for a long time now that enables every other hook denial perk in the game, to the point it's basically the bleed out perk if survivors are abusing it properly. It's Flip Flop. Flip Flop is a perk that converts a dying state recovery into wiggle progression at a ratio of 50%. So if you are halfway recovered and get picked up, your wiggle will already be at 25% completed. This is most commonly combined with Power Struggle, a perk that lets you pallet save yourself if a killer is under a pallet and you've wiggled 15% or more. If you go down under a pallet and a killer picks you up with 30% recovery, Flip Flop will give you 15% of your wiggle progress instantly and you can pallet save yourself for free. With the new 45 second self recovery, it takes 13.5 seconds to recover yourself to the wiggle threshold to secure a free and instant pallet save on yourself. Let's take a look back at the contested save situation we had earlier. Say the person going down has Flip Flop and Power Struggle and the save is contested. Unless you down the rescuer in 13.5 seconds, the rescuer can then just fuck off to do whatever they want, and the person under the pallet is completely invincible. You can't pick them up because they'll save themselves, you can't slug them because they'll recover themselves. And the counter to this, which is bleeding the survivor out if they don't have Unbreakable up, doesn't exist anymore, so a survivor can do this an infinite number of times. Flip Flop enables other perks and strategies as well. What if you pick up someone with Flip Flop and the hook gets sabotaged? By the time you drop the survivor and wait for the hook to respawn, they'll have recovered enough that they'll either wiggle free when you pick them up, or just pick themselves up. Either way, that's a down you're just not getting. Maybe the hook was never there because of breakdown, or because someone died on it. Maybe it's down a drop and Boil Over will allow them to wiggle free. All it takes is a few seconds of hesitation to get rid of a potential flashlight or pallet saver, and suddenly the survivor lying on the ground is completely invincible. And depending on things like the map, survivor perks like Boil Over and hook distribution, all things that survivors can control more than you can, even an instant pickup might not be enough. The only counter to Unhookable Builds in situations is to bleed the survivor out, and that just can't happen anymore. Once it's active, the only counter to Flip Flop preventing you from getting a hook is to leave the survivor on the ground and use them as bait for the others to come pick them up and exert pressure like that. Surprise, surprise, infinite free self-pickups don't let you do that. Guess which killer is more vulnerable than the others to perks like Flip Flop that can punish the killer for leaving a survivor on the ground even if they have no other choice? I'll give you a clue, they're French, and aside from me and Lynxie, nobody fucking plays them. I get that being bled out for 4 minutes by a starstruck nurse who thinks they're hot shit is irritating, I really do. But it's important to remember there's another side to this game as well. And it's not fun either to be effectively held hostage by a group of players abusing map layout and perk design to drag the game out, with the killer unable to progress their objective through no fault of their own. We saw this with No Mither during the breakdown bug that permanent disabled hooks. We saw this after the Boil Over buff that turned every other match into a hostage situation. And I worry it's going to happen again, with survivors abusing the fact they can't be bled out by running perks and map offerings that can only be countered by forcing bleedouts. Countering slugging by making self-pickups based kit is a good thing in a vacuum, but the game just wasn't designed around it, and won't be ready for that feature until a lot, and I mean a lot, of stuff around slugging is ironed out. Unhookable builds need to go. Flip Flop, breakdown, perks like that need to be totally reworked. Hooks need to respawn after a survivor dies with them to stop artificially creating hook dead zones. The interaction between survivors and killers during situations like flashlight saves, pallet saves and sabotages need to be looked into, so there's an actual risk to survivors making plays like this that's consummate to the reward they get from them. Maps need to have more hooks in difficult locations like corners or main buildings to make hostage situations less common. Killers who are balanced around using their powers in short periods of time to get the most value out of their powers need to be compensated so they can apply more consistent pressure throughout the match. Oni, Myers, Plague, Huntress, even Trickster. And more critically than anything else, Twins need help. You can't just make a killer who physically can't pick survivors up in a timely fashion and then insist that they pick survivors up in a timely fashion. That's how you make a killer basically impossible to play, especially when they're already incredibly unpopular. Don't get me wrong, if everybody had the base pickup of 45 seconds, and nobody ran Unbreakable or Hook Denial, and nobody played around self-pickups by contesting pallet saves and whatnot, Twins would probably be okay. They would struggle, dear lord they would struggle, but they'd probably be relegated to dedicated fans like myself and Linksy, who would continue to get results. But if survivors take advantage of the free pressure alleviation that infinite self-pickups provide by contesting saves, if perks like Flip-Flop are run to take advantage of the inability to bleed survivors out, and especially if Unbreakable goes unchanged, that will kill them stone dead in their current state. So much of Dead by Daylight is balanced, both in fairness and fun, by the capacity of the killer to drop a survivor on the ground, or leave them there, and for that to matter, to have consequences that the team has to deal with. Simply removing the ability for a slugged survivor to be a detriment the team has to solve to progress the game, without addressing why players, especially certain killers, slug is going to cause more problems than it solves. Thankfully, we have a while to go before this update goes anywhere near live servers, so I encourage players to be as vocal as possible with any concerns you have. Don't abuse devs, don't go after anyone in particular, because I know players do that and it's incredibly cringe of you. Absolute small dick energy. I shouldn't have to say that, but I just want to cover myself a bit. But there is time to get this feature delayed or have changes made around it. I just hope behaviour takes a step back and realises just how critical it is to get this change right. Alright, big thanks to my friend Scooty Booty for helping me record some of these clips, and for offering that fair and balanced Blake game that was in the B-roll footage. Check out his Twitch if you like, while I know he plays a ton of both Wesker and Nemesis. Speaking of Twitch, I'll be streaming DVD again on Saturday where I'll play more lore-friendly builds, which will be put into video content on YouTube. If you're interested in not missing it, then please do subscribe, and the links to my socials are all down in the description. Now, I had that Evil Dead video planned, but the PTB has fucked with my brilliant schemes. Well, I guess that's what we're working on now, so I'll see you then. Ta-ta for now.